Welcome back to Boring Science for Sleep. If you enjoy these quiet working life histories, leave a comment and consider liking and subscribing. Tonight, we're stepping onto a working canal in northern England to spend a day with a lockkeeper. It is still dim outside, and the lock cottage feels cool at the edges. You set the kettle on the range and let the first small sounds arrive: water against stone, a hinge settling. Before any boat moves, you check the head gauge and note the wet mark where the level sat overnight. A pound that is sitting a little low changes your whole morning because every lockful has to be handled slowly. Your keyring is heavy in your pocket and you test a paddle gear by hand, feeling for smooth teeth and a clean seat. Then you open the logbook, write the first line of the day, and decide how carefully you can afford to spend water. What happens to the schedule when one gate won't seal cleanly and a thin sheet of leakage keeps stealing head from the pound? You hold the pencil a moment longer than you need to because the answer isn't written down anywhere. It's written in the height of the water and the way the stone stays dark where it was wet. Outside, the towpath is a pale strip and the canal lies still like it's holding its breath. You listen again and you catch it, the soft steady hiss where the top gate should be quiet. It's not a rush, not a roar, just a thin sheet of water slipping through a bad meeting of timber and stone. That's your first escalation of the day, because every minute that hiss continues, the upper pound sinks a little more. You take your lamp down from its hook and you step out, closing the cottage door with care. The air smells of damp earth, coal smoke from somewhere distant, and the faint metallic tang of wet iron. Your boots find the familiar hard-packed path, and the key ring knocks once against your thigh. At the top gate, you lay your palm on the balance beam, and you feel the cold soaked into the wood. You lean in, and you watch the seam where the gate meets the quine, and you see the bright line of moving water. You make a first decision without speaking it out loud. You decide you won't throw both paddles wide when the first boat arrives. You'll take the lock slower, and you'll take it with a keeper's patience, even if it earns you a look. Because this is the kind of morning where water is the real currency, and you're the one counting it. Back at the head gauge, you look again, and you compare the mark to yesterday's note. It's down by a small but honest amount, the sort that doesn't sound like much until you repeat it all day. A lockful isn't measured in numbers here so much as in feel. It's the way the current tugs at the gate as you crack a paddle, and the way the water climbs the masonry. You walk the coping stones, slow and careful, and you look along the pound above for any sign of a leak. Sometimes it's a muskrat hole in a bank, sometimes it's a sluice left cracked open, sometimes it's just time. Today you spot floating straw drifting toward the lock, and you watch it twist in a small current that shouldn't be there. That tells you the water is moving when it ought to be resting. You follow it with your eyes, and you see a faint swirl near the offside, where a paddle culvert feeds. You crouch, and you put your ear close to the stone, and you hear a quiet gurgle. Not a full flow, but enough to steal from you cup by cup while you do other work. You straighten up slowly, and you breathe out through your nose. The kettle will be singing by now, but you let it wait. A lockkeeper learns early that the water doesn't wait for tea. You go to the paddle gear, and you test it again, hand on the spindle, and you feel for slack. There's a slight wobble that wasn't there last week, a small looseness in the collar. It's not yet trouble, but it's a warning, and you note it in your mind like a mark on a map. Then down the cut, you hear the first sound of the day's traffic. It's not loud, just a distant clink of harness and the soft knock of a boat's stem against a bank. A horse snorts, and a man's voice carries for a moment, then falls away again. You turn, and you look along the towpath, and you see a shape moving through the dim, a long, low hull. Coal, you think, by the way it sits in the water. Loaded boats ride deep, and they move with a steadiness that looks almost sleepy. The steerer brings it in without hurry, because the canal teaches everyone the same lesson, sooner or later. But you can tell, even from here, that he expects you to be ready. You lift your hand in a small signal, not waving, just letting him know you've seen him. and before you touch a paddle, you glance once more at the head gauge. You make the second decision of the morning, quieter than the first. You decide to check the chamber for anything lodged on the sill before you cycle the lock. Because a low pound and a leaking gate is one problem. A gate that won't shut because of a branch, that's a problem that multiplies. You walk down into the empty chamber, steps damp underfoot, and the stone under the coping dark with age. The lock walls hold old scratches, old repair patches, and lines where water has stood through decades. You look to the sill, that hidden step where the gate closes, and you scan for pale wood or floating rubbish. A thin film of weeds clings to the edges, but nothing obvious catches your eye. Still, you take the boat hook from its resting place, and you sweep it gently along the waterline. It meets resistance for a moment, then slides free. Just weed, you tell yourself, and you keep the hook in hand anyway. The steerer is close now, and you can see the set of his shoulders through the morning mist. He calls out a greeting, and you answer in the same plain tone, not wasting words. You ask, lightly, how far he's come since last lock, and he tells you, and you note it. Distance matters for timing, and timing matters for water when the pound is low. You step to the top gates, and you rest your hand on the beam again. You open the small ground paddle first, just a crack, letting water whisper in. The sound changes at once, from stillness to motion, like someone drawing a slow breath. You watch the chamber fill, and you watch the upper pound at the same time, the way your eyes learn to split. The water rises against stone, and the boat waits, held on a line, patient for now. You don't lift the second paddle yet. You let the first do its work, because a sudden draw can pull too hard on the pound when it's already low. The steerer glances at you, and you can feel the question in the look. You answer without words, just by keeping your pace steady, your hand calm on the windlass. The windlass itself is worn smooth at the handle, iron polished by years of turning. You place it on the spindle, and it fits with a practiced click, square on square. Then you give it a slow, even turn, lifting the paddle another notch. You can feel the gear teeth engage, and you listen for any grind that says the iron is dry. Today it sounds mostly clean, but that earlier wobble is still there, faint under your palm. The lock fills, and when the levels meet, you open the top gates with a controlled push. The balance beam moves like a long levered thought, heavy but obedient when it's treated right. The coal boat glides forward, and the horse on the towpath takes a step, then another, as if it's all one machine. As the boat enters, you watch the clearance, the way the cabin roof passes under your line of sight. You watch the stern, and you watch the steerer's hands, because a lock is safest when everyone is reading the same moment. He brings it in straight, and you nod once, satisfied. Then you step to the lower paddles, and you pause again, feeling the day's constraint in your chest. The quick way is to drop it fast. The keeper's way, today, is to drop it with care. You open one paddle first, and the water begins to run out, pulling at the boat's sides. The hull creaks softly, a working sound, not a complaint. You keep the line snug, and you watch for the boat to settle evenly. And while it empties, you take out your logbook again, the one that lives in your coat pocket for this very reason. You write the boat's name, the cargo, the direction, and the toll due. The pencil leaves a faint grey sheen on the paper, and your handwriting is small and steady. When the levels equalize, you open the lower gates, and the coal boat eases out, slow as a thought. The steerer offers you a coin, and you take it, weighing it in your fingers. You count it once, then again, because mistakes aren't dramatic, they're just troublesome later. You tuck it away, and you watch the boat disappear down the line, following the curve of water. For a moment, the lock is empty again, and the hiss at the top gate returns to your awareness. It's still there, still stealing, and now you can hear it more clearly because the morning has grown quieter. You walk back up, and you put your fingers near the seam, careful of the cold water. The leak feels like a thin, constant ribbon. You don't have time to fix it properly now. Not alone, not with traffic starting. But you can do one small thing. You decide to clean the meeting face as best you can between boats, to give the timber a chance to seat. You take a stiff brush from the cottage shed, bristles wet and splayed from use. You scrub along the stone where the gate closes, lifting algae and grit. The smell that rises is sharp and green, like crushed weeds. You rinse it with a quick splash from the canal, and you watch the water run dark down the stone. Then you close the gate again, and you press it home with the beam, not forcing, just persuading. The leak lessens by a small amount, enough that you feel it more than you see it. That's a little victory, quiet and temporary, the sort you collect through a day. Down the towpath, more shapes are coming. Two narrow boats breasted together, moving as a pair, their cabins close like neighbors. They're not as heavy as coal, but they're eager, and eager boats can waste water in their own way. The steerers call out, asking if you'll have them through quick. You look at the head gauge again, and you look at the wet mark on the masonry. You make another decision, and you commit to it with your body. You signal them to hold a little back, to wait while you bring the lock to them in the most economical way. One of them answers with a sigh you can hear across the water. The other just nods, resigned, already settling into canal time. You begin the sequence again, but this time you time the paddles with more care. You lift a little, wait, listen, lift a little more. The water's voice tells you what it's doing, and you don't ask it to do too much at once. As the lock fills, you watch the pound above with a keeper's habit, always thinking ahead. The two boats come in, side by side, and you guide them with small gestures. A lock keeper's hands become their own language over the years. Palm down for slow, fingers pointing for line, a brief wave for stop. The boats settle, ropes creak against rings, and a cabin chimney sends up a thin thread of smoke. You smell tea on that smoke, and something fried, maybe bacon, carried on the cool air. It reminds you that your own kettle is long past boiling now. But you stay with the lock because the lock is the center of the day's rhythm. You draw them down, and the water pulls out in a steady run, not too fast, not too slow. One steerer says, not unkindly, that yesterday the keeper at the next lock moved them quicker. You don't argue. You simply glance toward the head gauge again, and you let him see you glance. Most boatmen understand water levels when they're shown, not told. And besides, you can feel that subtle drag again as you close the top gate after them. The gate meets the quoin, but not with a perfect kiss. There's a soft resistance, like something between, though you can't see it. That's another piece of evidence, small but persistent, and it keeps you alert. You take a moment while the boats are leaving to run your hand along the balance beam's iron strap. The strap is cold, damp, and pitted in places but sound. You check the heel post area with your eye, looking for any shift in the way it sits. Nothing obvious. Still, you write a tiny note in the margin of your logbook. Just a word. Seep. Gear. Watch. The morning continues in this measured way, each boat a small task, each lockage a careful exchange. A boat of timber comes through, smelling resinous even in damp air. A lighter craft with sacks of grain follows, the sacks covered in canvas, the edges darkened by rain. With each one, you feel the day's constraint. You're not only moving boats, you're balancing a whole stretch of canal, one lockful at a time, against a pound that wants to sink. And then, between lockages, you finally step back inside the cottage for a moment. The kettle has boiled itself quiet, and a skin has formed on the water. You pour it anyway, because the first cup is more warmth than taste. The tea smells comforting, tannic, and simple. Your boots leave damp marks on the stone floor, and the clock on the shelf ticks with a steady patience. You take 2 quick mouthfuls, and you don't sit down. Sitting down is a trick, because it tells the body it's done for a while. Instead, you take the cup with you to the door, and you look out over your lock again. The queue has thinned for the moment. The canal surface smooths, and the light strengthens, turning the water from black to slate to a dull silver. This is the first small window you've had since dawn, and you use it the way keepers always do. You go for your inspection walk. You set the cup down inside, and you pick up the long rake from the shed, the one with the iron tines. The handle is rough under your palm, and it smells faintly of old, wet wood. You walk along the pound above, eyes scanning for the telltale signs of trouble. A leak is often betrayed by motion, reeds bending the wrong way. A line of bubbles, a patch of bank that stays too wet. You pass a mooring ring set into stone, worn shiny by rope. You pass a spot where someone has dropped coal dust, leaving a black stain on the towpath. And as you walk, you watch bits of floating straw, and you watch how they drift. They don't all drift the same way, and you notice the ones that hesitate. A straw stem will travel straight for a few yards, then pause as if it's thinking, then turn toward the offside bank. That little turn tells you there's a pull you can't see, a slow sideways theft of water. You stop where the towpath stones are a darker brown, and you look at the foot of the bank. The grass there is greener, heavier with moisture, as if it's being watered from underneath. You crouch down and you press 2 fingers into the soil. It gives more than it should. Not mud, not a collapse, just that soft sponge feeling of earth that's been drinking steadily. You listen for sound, because leaks have voices. You hold still, and the canal sounds settle into layers. A bird somewhere in the hedge, the faint clink of a horse's shoe on stone, and under it all, a low, constant sip. It's the kind of thing most people would never hear, unless they were paid to hear it. You follow the sound a few steps, slow, like you're tracking it by patience alone. It leads you to a place where the bank has been patched in the past. A strip of different clay, pressed and smoothed, with grass growing thin over it. You can see the old shovel marks, softened by years. You don't dig. Not yet. Digging is a big act, and big acts belong to a different part of the day. For now, you make a mental note and you choose the smallest response that still counts. You take your boot heel and you tap along the towpath edge, feeling for hollow spots. Most of it is firm. Then one place gives a duller sound. You mark it with a small stone, set on the coping where you'll see it again. A keeper's work is often like that. Small marks for later, little promises you make to yourself. You walk on, and as the pound narrows, the wind reaches the surface more easily. It wrinkles the water in fine lines, and those lines show you the current. Where the surface is smooth, the water is resting. Where it's patterned wrong, something is moving underneath. You come to the spillway, a simple overflow where the canal can shed extra water in heavy rain. Today it's quiet. No bright sheet of water, no chatter over stone. That tells you the pound isn't high enough to waste anything. You rest your hand on the iron rail there for a moment. Cold iron, damp with the morning. You think about the old canal company rules written in neat ink. Save water in dry spells, keep the gates tight, report leaks at once. But rules don't walk the bank. You do. You turn back toward the lock because your window of quiet won't last. Even on a slow day, the canal sends you work in waves. As you approach the top gate again, you look at the chamber walls. The stone is mottled with dark patches where water has stood, and pale patches where it dries. There's a long scratch line on one side from some past boat that came in crooked. You run your eye along it without thinking, like reading a familiar sentence. At the gate, you check the seam again. The bright line of seepage is still there. Less than before your scrubbing, but not gone. You set the long rake down on the grass, and you take up the windlass. You fit it to the paddle spindle, and you give it a gentle test turn without lifting anything. You're feeling for that earlier looseness. The wobble answers back under your palm. Not worse, not better, just there. You don't force it. A keeper learns that forcing is how you turn a small fault into an all-day stoppage. Instead, you take out a rag from your pocket, already stained with old grease. You wipe the spindle end and the square socket clean. Grit there can make a windlass sit crooked, and crooked turning wears teeth. Small causes, long consequences. You take the grease tin from the cottage shed, the lid stiff and gritty. When it opens, The smell comes up at once. Old tallow and mineral grease. Heavy and familiar. You smear a little onto the gear teeth you can reach. Not a lot, just enough to quiet the metal and help it seat. Then you turn the spindle again, and the feel improves by a hair. That's the kind of improvement you take without celebrating. Down the cut, the next boat announces itself in the usual way. Not with a whistle, but with sound carried on water. A cabin door shutting, a pole tapping the bank, a voice calling to a horse. You step to the lock side where you can see both approaches. A single narrow boat this time, not paired. Its paint is tired, and the cabin side shows a patch where it's been sanded and repainted. The steerer sits steady, one hand on the tiller, the other tucked in a coat pocket. He looks up as if you're part of the landscape. You lift your hand, and he answers with a small nod. He brings the boat in slowly, letting it glide. The bow wave is gentle, hardly a wave at all. That's a man who's not looking for trouble. You like him at once, for that reason alone. As the boat comes alongside the lock landing, you glance at the horse. Not all boats have one these days, but many still do. This one's horse is lean, with a shaggy coat, steam faint at its nostrils. The boy leading it walks with his hands in the rope, calm and practiced. You hear the rope slide over a ring, a soft rasp. Everything is ordinary. Ordinary is what you aim for. You ask the steerer where he's bound. He tells you plain. You ask if he's heard anything about levels ahead. He shrugs and says the pound above the next lock was a bit down yesterday evening. That matches what you're seeing. It's never just one lock, never just one gate. It's a system of small losses and small savings. You set about filling the lock again. Ground paddle first, a crack, then a pause. The water enters with a soft pressure sound, like breath through teeth. You keep your eyes on the top pound, watching the surface dip. The drop is slight, but you feel it in your chest anyway. You tell yourself, steady. There's enough water. If you don't waste it, you raise the other paddle in short stages. A quarter turn. Wait. Another quarter. Wait. Each time you feel the gear teeth settle. Each time you listen for a clunk that would say the paddle has jumped. It doesn't. The lock fills like it should, slowly, without drama. That's good. But the seam in the gate still shimmers. When the level comes even, you push the gate open. The balance beam moves with that long, heavy swing. You've learned to use your hip and shoulder together, not your arms. Arms get tired. Weight and leverage don't. The boat glides in, and the steerer uses a light touch on the tiller. The hull brushes the wall with a whisper of wet wood against stone. No bump. No rush. As the boat settles, you hook the line around a bollard. You show the boy where to stand with the horse, so the rope stays clear. The boy's eyes follow your hand. He does as you indicate without needing more. This is a world where people learn by watching, because no one wants to waste words. Now you begin to empty the lock. Again, one paddle first, and as the water starts to leave, you watch the boat's stern. Boats can swing when the flow catches them. A stern can drift, and a rudder can catch on masonry. So you keep the line snug, and you watch the rope angle. The water pulls. The boat answers. Then it steadies. While it empties, you take out the logbook. Paper has a smell of its own, slightly dusty, slightly sweet, as if it remembers the mill. You write down the name, if you can read it. Some are painted so faded you guess. Some are stamped on a brass plate by the cabin. You note the cargo from what you can see. Sacks, barrels, empty, coal. You write direction. Up or down, then toll. The toll is a small ritual, a coin in your palm, a glance at the book. Sometimes a quick word if there's a dispute. Most days there isn't. A canal works best when everyone agrees the rules are boring. The lock empties. The lower gates open. The boat slides out with the last of the draw. The boy clicks softly to the horse, and they take up the towpath again. The steerer gives you a short look of thanks, not sentimental, just human. Then he's gone around the bend. The lock is empty again. And you hear once more the thin hiss at the top gate. Now, with traffic lighter, you allow yourself a longer look. You walk down into the chamber. The steps are slick with algae near the waterline. You place your foot carefully, feeling for the roughness in the stone that gives grip. Down at the sill end, you look along the recess where the bottom of the gate meets. The sill itself is underwater when the lock is full. When it's empty, you can sometimes see the top edge, a darker line. You can't see much today, not without dropping the level further. But you can still check for signs. You look at the way water moves near the sill, even at low level. A small eddy, a bubble that repeats in one spot, a floating leaf that keeps returning, like it's tied to a string. Those are clues. And today, near the lower gate, you notice that repeating swirl. It's subtle, but it's there. That swirl tells you something is interrupting the gate's seal. Maybe a branch, maybe a plank, maybe just a wedge of debris. Not enough to stop the gate, but enough to make it leak and steal head. You feel that familiar tightening in your stomach. Not fear, just the awareness that your easy day is being negotiated away. Shh. You climb out again, and you retrieve the long rake. The tines are heavy. The handle shifts in your hands. This tool has been used by men before you, and it shows. The wood is polished where palms have held it, splintered where it's been dropped. You stand at the lock edge, and you lower the rake into the water near the sill, slowly, carefully, not jabbing. You don't want to make things worse by pushing debris deeper. You feel along the bottom in small arcs, stone, silt, then something that gives slightly, like wet wood. You adjust your angle and pull gently. There's resistance, then a slow release. A strip of weed comes up, long and stringy, dripping. Not the culprit. You set it aside on the grass, then you try again. The rake teeth catch on something firmer this time. You pull, and a small branch rises, water streaming off it. That could have been enough. It isn't large, but it's shaped like a hook, the kind that finds a seam and holds on. You toss it to the bank. You watch the water near the sill. The swirl lessens. Not gone, but calmer. You take that as another small victory. Then you go to close the lower gate and test it. You swing it shut, and you watch the seam. You look for the bright line. There it is, but thinner now. You press the beam gently, seating it. The line fades further. You exhale without meaning to. You don't say anything, because no one's there to hear, but you feel that quiet satisfaction anyway. This is what a keeper does when the canal gives him a little time. He earns back small amounts of order, and with that done, you return to the top end again, because the top gate leak is still your main concern. You check the seam. Still a fine shimmer, better than at dawn, but not right. You touch the timber near the quoin. It's swollen slightly from moisture, as old wood does. Timber changes shape with weather. In damp spells it swells, closing gaps. In dry spells it shrinks, opening seams. A lock keeper watches timber like a farmer watches cloud. You consider your options. You could tighten the gate's meeting with a simple adjustment if the fittings allow it. Some gates have small iron straps and bolts that can be taken up a fraction. But that's not a job you do casually with boats arriving. You need time. You need the right spanner. And you need the water level not pressing hard against the gate while you work. So you choose again the keeper's choice. You postpone. But you note. In the margin of your logbook, you add another word. Coin. Just that. A reminder. Because memory is good, but paper is better. The sun climbs higher, and the morning chill softens. You feel it in the way your shoulders loosen. The canal brightens a little. The water turns more reflective, showing pale sky and the dark silhouettes of trees. A kingfisher flashes low along the bank, a quick streak of blue you barely catch. It's gone before you can enjoy it, but you remember it anyway. The lull continues a while longer than you expect. That's the canal's rhythm. Rush, then quiet. You use the quiet to do the small jobs that keep the place from slipping. You walk to the lockside fence, and you check the latch. Loose latches become lost gates. You straighten a chain that's been dragged. You pick up a bit of broken rope and coil it, because rope underfoot becomes accidents. Then you wipe your hands on your rag and you stand for a moment with nothing in them. There's a particular peace in standing beside a lock when it isn't being used. The chamber is still, the gates are shut, the paddles are down, the water on either side holds itself at its level, patient and heavy. It feels like a held breath. But then the sound arrives, as it always does. A boat coming faster than it should. Not a crash, not a shout. Just that certain hurry in the water. You hear a bow wave slapping the bank farther up. You hear a line ring clink as someone grabs it in a quick movement. Then you see the boat, loaded deep, lower in the water than the ones earlier, and moving with a determined glide that doesn't match the afternoon's calm. The horse is tired, you can tell even from here. Its head is low, the pace is uneven, the tow line is tight, as if the boat is still pulling even when it shouldn't. The steerer stands a little rigid. You've seen this posture before. A man who's trying to make up time. You step forward and you raise your hand in the signal for slow. Palm down. A calm pressing motion. The steerer sees you, but he doesn't answer immediately. His eyes flick to the lock, then to the channel, then back to you. The boat keeps coming, not dangerously, but too quickly for a careful approach. Your mind runs through the possibilities. A tired horse means less control. A heavy boat means more momentum. A low pound means you can't waste water on mistakes. You call out, not sharply, just clearly. Easy now. Hold her off. The steerer shifts his stance. You see his jaw tighten. He eases the tiller, but the boat still has its own idea. Water and weight don't change their minds quickly. And as he tries to check the glide, the bow drifts a hair off center. Not much, just enough. The stem comes toward the gate. You take 2 steps toward the balance beam, ready to keep the gate from swinging, but you're a fraction late. The bow makes contact, not a bang, but a solid bump, timber on timber. The gate shudders. The beam trembles under your hand. For a moment, everything goes quiet in the way it does after a mistake. The horse stops, sensing it. The rope slackens. The steerer holds still, as if not moving will undo what happened. You feel the vibration in the gate travel into your wrist, and you think of that earlier note. Wobble. Gear. Watch. You look at the top gate seam. The bright line of seepage flares a little wider, as if the gate has shifted against its seat. Then it settles. But you don't like what you've seen. You don't say much. You simply hold the beam and test the gate's movement. It swings, but the last inch feels different. A slight catch, a soft resistance that wasn't there before. The steerer calls out an apology that sounds half like irritation. You answer with a nod, not taking the bait. You ask him to hold where he is, just off the gate. You ask him to keep the boat steady on the line. You tell the boy with the horse to stand still and wait. Your voice stays even, because your voice sets the temperature for everyone else. Now you go to the paddle gear. This is where a small knock can become a bigger problem. A gate doesn't live alone. It's tied to ironwork, to heel posts, to paddles and spindles and collars. If something is already loose, a bump can make it show itself. You set the windlass on the spindle. You turn just to test the seat. And you feel it. The gear doesn't settle cleanly. It has that faint wobble, but now it also has a small unwillingness. Like a tooth is catching. You stop. You don't force. You take the windlass off and look down at the mechanism. The iron is wet with dew and canal spray. A bit of grit shines in the teeth. You wipe it with your rag. You try again, gently. The spindle turns, but the paddle doesn't seem to drop fully when you ease it down. That's a bad sign. A paddle that won't seat will keep drawing water. A paddle that won't seat when you need it to, that's worse. You go to the other paddle, the one on the opposite side. You test that one. It feels better. Not perfect, but better. So you make your decision. You're going to work this lockage in a different order. Slower, more controlled. You'll use the paddle that behaves and you'll avoid relying on the one that's become stubborn. You signal the steerer again to wait. He shifts, impatient, but he holds. The boat drifts a little, and you have him take a turn of rope around a ring, just enough to keep her steady. You watch his hands, you watch the rope, you watch the water. Everything is information. Then you check the level again. Head gauge, wet mark. The pound is still low, and now the bumped gate and the unseating paddle threaten to lower it further. You look from the gauge to the gate, and you let your shoulders drop a fraction. You can't afford to let the lock pull hard on the pound. Not today. So you do what you always do when things start to go a little wrong. You slow everything down until it's slow enough to be safe. You walk to the steerer and speak close enough that he doesn't have to shout. You tell him you're going to bring him in, but you'll need him to hold steady and listen. You ask him to keep his bow off the gate and to keep the line ready in his hand. You ask the boy to keep the horse still and not to let it edge forward. The boy nods, and he shifts his weight, settling into the rope like it's a rail. The horse flicks an ear and stands, head low, breathing out slow. You step back to the top paddles again. You choose the better one, the one that still feels honest under the windlass. A lock has a way it likes to be worked, but it also has ways it will accept when it's tired. Today, you're asking it to accept a different order. You crack the good paddle just enough to start the fill, and you watch the water in the upper pound closely. You're watching for that first small dip, the first sign you're drawing too fast. The chamber begins to take water with a steady hush. The sound is soft, but the pressure behind it is real. You keep your hand resting on the windlass handle, not turning, just feeling through the iron. A keeper learns to feel vibration like another kind of hearing. The stubborn paddle stays shut for now. You leave it alone, as if ignoring it might keep it from becoming worse. With the chamber filling slowly, you walk to the gate you bumped. You run your fingertips along the meeting edge, careful and quick, feeling for raised grain or grit. The timber is wet and cold. It's swollen in places, but there's a spot that feels slightly bruised, a small crushed ridge. That ridge won't stop the gate from closing, but it can keep it from closing clean. Clean closure is what saves water. You glance into the lock chamber and judge the rise, not by numbers, but by the wet line climbing the stone. When the level is partway up, you return to the paddle and give it another small lift. You do it in a measured quarter turn, then you stop again. The steerer watches your hands like he's watching a clock. He's impatient, but he's quiet now. There's a point in every delay where people either start to argue or they start to cooperate. Your calm helps decide which one happens. The lock reaches near equal. You look at the seam at the top gate and you see that it's still seeping but not flaring. That's something. You go to open the gate. You put your palm on the balance beam and take your stance, feet braced on damp stone. The beam moves, but the gate hesitates at the very start. Not stuck, just reluctant. It's a small change, and that's what makes it dangerous. Small changes invite people to push harder than they should. You don't push hard. You push steady. You let the hinge work in its own time, and the gate swings open. You signal the steerer in, slow and straight, palm down, then a gentle point where you want his bow to land. He edges forward. The boat's weight carries it, but the line and the horse hold it from rushing. The bow passes the gate with an inch to spare. No touch this time, just a soft glide and the whisper of hull against water. When the boat is in, you have him take a turn of rope around the ring. You keep the line snug so the boat won't surge when you start to empty. Then you shut the top gate behind him. And this is where you learn what the bump really did. The gate comes in, meets the quoin, and stops a fraction short of the true seat. You can feel it through the beam. A tiny springiness, like something is holding it off. You press, not hard, and it refuses to go that last inch. It isn't dramatic. It's worse than dramatic. It's subtle. You lean down and look at the seam. The bright line of water is back, stronger than it was an hour ago. A thin sheet, steady, and now it's not just a nuisance. Now it's a drain. You keep your face neutral and stand up again. Boatmen red faces quickly, and you don't want to start a ripple. You tell the steerer you're going to lower him, but you'll do it slow, and he'll need to keep his stern centered. He answers with a tight nod. Now you go to the lower paddles. And here, you make another quiet choice. You do not open both paddles. Even though it would be faster, you open the one that draws cleanly, and you leave the other down. The water begins to run out, and the boat settles. The stern tries to swing, then the line holds it. You stand near the middle of the chamber, eyes moving between the boat and the gates. You're watching for the moment when the pull changes. Because in a lock, flow is never exactly symmetrical. A tiny difference in paddle opening, a tiny bit of debris, and the boat will drift. You adjust by inches, a tug on a line, a hand signal, a quiet word. The boat comes down in level. The steerer relaxes just a little as he feels it behaving. But you can't relax, not with that top gate leaking behind you, drawing water you don't want to spend. When the lock is nearly empty, you go to open the lower gate, and for a moment it feels normal again. The gate swings, the boat slides out, slow, and the horse steps forward. The tow line tightens, and the whole long shape moves away. You take the toll quickly, almost absent-mindedly, and you write the line in the book. You keep your handwriting steady, even though your mind is already on the gate. Now the lock is empty, and you can finally give the problem your full attention. You close the lower gates and walk back up to the top. The afternoon light has that softened look it gets after midday, pale and slanting. You put your hand on the top balance beam again. You pull the gate open and then bring it closed, slowly, watching the final inch. It stops short again. It's consistent. Consistency is useful, even when it's bad. You crouch, and you look low, close to the waterline where you can see the scene best. You watch the water thread itself through. There's a small area where it's brighter, like a tiny waterfall over a lip. That's the worst point. You take the boat hook and probe carefully along the meeting face, where you can reach. You feel slime and weed and the hard edge of timber. Then you feel something that doesn't belong. A small, hard wedge, not stone, not wood grain, maybe a chip, maybe a splinter, maybe a bit of gravel pressed in. You try to flick it out, but it won't budge. It's caught between the gate and the quoin, pinned by water pressure. Now you understand the situation. The bump didn't just shake the gate. It pressed something into the seam, and now the water is helping hold it there. You stand up slowly. You look at the head gauge again. It's not plummeting, but it's moving. A slow, steady loss. And behind you, you hear another sound. A boat approaching from below, then another. The canal is sending the next wave. You step to the lock side and look down the cut. You can see the first one coming, and behind it, a second hull, waiting its turn. Their bows make small V-shapes in the water. The men aboard have that forward-leaning posture of people who expect the lock to be available. They don't know yet that your lock is about to become slow. You raise your hand in greeting, and then you hold your palm down again, the slow signal. They answer with looks, and you can almost hear their thoughts. You don't blame them. They've been on the move since morning. They measure their day in miles and lock flights, and a delay is a real thing. But you measure your day in water level, and in the tone of a gate when it closes, and your gate's tone is wrong. You decide you won't pretend it's fine. You decide you'll manage it openly, calmly, and in a way that keeps the canal moving. That's the keeper's job when a lock goes a little lame. Not to panic, not to hero it, just to keep the line steady. The first boat comes alongside the lower landing. It's loaded, but not as deep as coal, maybe brick, or mixed cargo under a tarp. The steerer calls up, asking if you'll have him through. You tell him you will, but you'll need him to come in easy, because the top gate is not sealing right. He squints up at the gate, then back at you. He's deciding how much he trusts your judgment. You don't dress it up. You tell him plain that you've got a leak at the top and you're conserving water. You say it the way you'd say the weather. He makes a face, but he nods. A boatman can argue with a person, but he can't argue with a low pound. You begin cycling the lock for him. Lower paddles, but again not wide. A crack, then a pause. As the chamber fills from below, you keep watching that top gate, because even while you're working, it's leaking. It's like trying to fill a bucket with a pinhole. You can still fill it. You just have to be patient. The boat enters, and you bring the bottom gate shut behind it. Then you start to raise the water. Here's where the leak bites hardest, because when you fill, you're taking water from the already low pound above, and the gate is already letting some of that water slip away. You choose to fill slower than usual to avoid drawing the pound down in a sudden dip. Fast filling can create a temporary low that grounds boats upstream. You lift the good top paddle in tiny increments. Quarter turn, wait. Another quarter, wait. You look at the upper pound surface and judge the draw. It dips, then steadies. Your timing is working, but the gate seam keeps shining, a thin, bright strip, unbroken. The boatman watches, and he says, half to himself, that this will back the whole flight up. You answer quietly that it might, and that's when you hear something else, not in the lock, up along the pound. A faint sucking sound, like water being pulled through a narrow throat. It's not loud, but you've trained your ear. You pause your hand on the windlass and listen. That sound is new, or maybe it's been there, and now the leak has made it noticeable. You don't stop the lockage because you can't leave a boat half risen, but you file the sound away. Another small note in the mind. The lock reaches level. You go to open the top gate, and again it hesitates, then swings. The boat slides out, and the steerer gives you a look that's not angry, just tired. He wants the world to behave. So do you. You close the top gate, and it stops short again. The seam shines. You glance at the head gauge. Lower than it should be for this hour, and drifting. It's become a math you can do without numbers. Every lockful, plus the leak, equals trouble by evening. Now, as you turn to face the next boat waiting below, you see that it isn't one, it's two, and behind them, another shape, further back. The canal has noticed your delay, and it has responded by stacking work in front of you. Not as punishment, just as a consequence. You step to the lock side and raise your hand in the wait signal. You point to a ring indicating where they should tie up. A man on the bow throws a rope with practiced ease. The rope lands, loops, and pulls taut. The boat settles against the landing with a soft bump. Now, with a moment while the chamber empties, you make a choice you've been avoiding. You're going to try to clear whatever is pinning the top gate. But you can't drain the lock fully. Draining takes time, and it wastes water, and it would stop the whole line. You need a method that works between lockages, a keeper's method. Small tools, small movements, patience. You go to the cottage shed and take out the stiff brush again, and a smaller scraper. A flat piece of iron with a worn edge used for paint and weeds and old deposits. You also take a short-handled mallet, not for striking hard but for nudging, and you bring them back to the top gate. You kneel at the lock edge and lean close. You can see where the seam is brightest. That's where the wedge is. You slip the scraper into the seam as far as it will go. It won't go far. The pressure is holding it tight. You pull it back out and wipe the edge. A smear of green slime. A tiny glint. Sand, maybe. You try again, changing the angle. You scrape along the stone face just beside the seam, cleaning it. Sometimes, cleaning the quoin gives the gate a better chance to seat. You work slowly, because one slip would send the scraper into the water, and you'd lose it. And losing a tool is another delay. When you've cleaned what you can reach, you stand and try the gate again. You pull it open a few inches, then close it carefully, letting it come home under its own weight. It stops short again. The problem is still there. Now you try the mallet, and you do it with care. You tap the balance beam, not to force the gate, but to vibrate it. Sometimes a vibration will free a grain of stone or a splinter. Sometimes it won't. You tap once. Then again, the sound is dull wood on wood. No sharp crack. You watch the seam. You want to see the bright line change. It doesn't. You stop. You don't tap again. Because too much tapping becomes forcing, and forcing splits things. So you accept what the lock is telling you. This won't be cleared by small nudges, not while the head is pressing on the gate. To free that wedge, you'll need to reduce pressure, which means lowering the level on one side just enough to take the squeeze off. And that means a controlled drawdown, a careful one you'll have to do while boats are waiting. You look along the queue again, men sitting on cabin tops, pipes lit, a woman stirring something in a pan inside a cabin, the smell of onions drifting out, a child's face appearing at a hatch, watching. Waiting boats become their own little village, and you're the one with the key to when it moves. You decide you'll keep the queue calm by giving them a plan. So you speak up, not shouting, just projecting. You tell them the top gate's not seating and you're losing water. You tell them you'll be passing boats through, but one at a time and slower. You ask them to keep their lines ready and to come in and out steady. No ramming, no rushing. They grumble a little, but it's the normal kind. The kind that passes time without changing anything. Now you begin the next cycle. You bring the waiting boat up, you fill slowly, you open, pass, close. Each time the top gate stops short, each time the seam shines. And as the afternoon stretches, you feel the lock becoming a bottleneck. Not closed, but slow. Not broken, but imperfect. Your notebook becomes more than a record. It becomes a schedule. You begin writing not just names and tolls, but order. Who arrived first? Who is loaded deepest? Who can't afford to sit on the mud if the pound drops? Because as the gate leaks, the pound above drops, and boats upstream will start to feel it. They'll feel it as a soft scrape under the hull, a hesitation where yesterday there was glide. Between Lockages, you finally walk a short way up the upper pound toward the sound you heard earlier. That faint sucking. You keep your lantern unlit in daylight, but you carry it anyway out of habit, the weight familiar. You walk along the towpath, eyes on the water. You see the surface moving strangely near the bank, a small funnel-like motion. Not a whirlpool, just a persistent draw. And there, half hidden by weeds, you find a paddle culvert outlet that should be quiet when the paddle is down, but it isn't quiet. It's whispering. That means that stubborn paddle you tested earlier is not seating. It's leaking through its own gate, drawing water even when you think it's closed. You stand still, listening. The sound is like water through reeds, but steadier, more mechanical. You feel a slow frustration, but you keep it small, because frustration doesn't fix ironwork. You go back to the paddle gear and test it again. You lift the windlass and set it on. You turn slightly, then ease back. The spindle moves, but the feel is wrong. It doesn't drop into its seat with that final satisfying settle. A paddle is a simple thing in principle, a wooden or iron slide, lifted by a rack and pinion or by a screw, depending on the lock. When it's down, it blocks the waterway. When it's up, it lets water pass. And when it's in between, even by the width of a fingernail, it becomes a quiet tap that never stops. That little tap, all afternoon, adds up to inches on a gauge. You stand with the windlass still in your hand, and you watch the spindle as if it might confess. The square end is worn bright, and the socket has a tiny rounding at two corners. That rounding is enough to let the windlass rock, and it makes your turning feel uncertain. You shift your grip, and you try again slower, listening for the moment the paddle should settle. It doesn't settle. Instead, you feel a faint spring through the gear, like the rack is meeting grit, or a bent tooth. You stop with the paddle neither fully trusted up nor fully trusted down. You take the windlass off and set it on the grass, where it won't roll. Then you kneel by the gear housing, close enough to smell wet iron and old grease. On these locks, the paddle gear is often simple: a cast iron frame holding a pinion, with a rack attached to the paddle rod. The pinion turns when you turn the spindle, and the rack moves up or down in a straight line. In theory, it's tidy. In practice, water finds its way into everything, and grit rides in on every splash. You run your finger along the rack teeth you can reach, and you feel a roughness that shouldn't be there. A small pebble, maybe, or a lump of dried silt pressed into the grease. You pick at it with the corner of your scraper, and it breaks away in crumbs. Now you turn the spindle a fraction with your bare hand, just enough to feel the pinion move. It's still not right. Not jammed, not broken. Just unwilling. The kind of unwilling that means the paddle is not coming down square onto its seat. And while you're down at this level, you hear it again. That soft water voice in the culvert. A whisper that says water is passing when it should be held. You stand up slowly because you can't fix this with a fingertip and a good thought. You can only manage it. And managing, for now, means you treat that paddle as if it's partly open all the time. So you adjust your day around a slow, constant loss. You glance up and down the cut, gauging the line of waiting boats like you'd gauge weather. There are more now. Two tied below, one hovering off the landing, another easing in behind with its horse walking tired circles. Above, you can see a bow just peeking out from the bend, waiting for enough depth to come down. The leak at the gate and the leak at the paddle are working together, like two hands pulling at the same rope. You take out your notebook again. You make a new kind of entry, not a toll line, but a working note. Top gate not seating, offside top paddle not dropping, upper pound falling steady. Then you draw a small line under it, as if that makes it official. Now you have to decide how to keep boats from grounding, and how to keep the pound from emptying itself by evening. You step to the edge of the upper pound and look at the waterline on the stone. The wet mark is lower than it was at dawn, and you can see more of the masonry's pale face. A boat that draws a lot of water will start to feel that, especially near the lock mouth where silt collects. So you choose a new rule for the afternoon: heaviest boats first, whenever you can. It sounds backward, but it isn't. A heavy boat left waiting in a falling pound becomes a stuck boat, and stuck boats waste more water than anything. You walk down to the lower landing and speak to the first steerer in the line. You ask his load, he tells you, coal and slack, deep in the hold. You nod, and you tell him he'll go next. The man behind him makes a small complaint, half-hearted, just to mark that he exists. You answer with a brief look at the gauge stone, then back at him. Most arguments soften when they meet a visible line on masonry. You have the coal boat bring its bow in close, and take a turn of rope around the ring. You tell the horseboy to keep the line snug, and not to let the boat surge. Then you begin another lockage, but with your mind doing two jobs at once. You're moving a boat, and you're rationing a reservoir. To bring the coal boat up from below, you need water from above. But you already know water is bleeding away, through that gate seam and through that paddle culvert. So you do what keepers have always done when the arithmetic turns sour. You slow the whole exchange down, to keep it from swinging. You open the working paddle in small stages, and you listen for any change in tone. A clean paddle has a steady voice, like a firm paw. A dirty or misseated one coughs and gurgles, changing pitch. This one, the good one, stays steady, so you trust it, and you keep the other one closed as best you can. The coal boat enters the lock, deep and quiet. The gunwales close to the water. The steerer stands with his shoulders set, but his hands are careful. Men with heavy loads become careful because weight is its own instruction. You close the lower gates behind him, and the gate chains clink as they settle. Then you turn to the top end, and you begin to fill from the upper pound. You raise the good paddle again only part way. The chamber takes water, and the upper pound gives it up with a slow, visible dip. You watch that dip like you're watching a child lean too far over a wall, not with panic, with attention. And as the lock rises, the top gate leak continues. a thin, bright ribbon of waste beside your work. It feels wrong to take water in with one hand while it slips away through the other. But you can't stop the day. You can only guide it. When the levels meet, you open the top gate. It hesitates, then gives. The coal boat eases forward, and you can hear the hull brushing the lock wall in a soft, gritty whisper. He clears the gate without bumping, and you're grateful for small mercies. Once he's out, you close the gate. It stops short, as always now, and the seam shines again. You take the toll, write the line, and wave him on. Then you step back and look at your lock as if it's a machine that's developed a limp. A limp can be worked with for a while, but it has to be understood. Now you begin letting boats through in a controlled trickle, and you start using the people waiting as part of your method. You ask one crew to line their boat through the lock mouth rather than powering in. Lining means they take the rope in hand and walk it, keeping the boat straight without a burst of throttle or a shove from a pole. You ask another to wait with their bow clear of the gates, so you can test closures without their hull pressing water around. Each request is small, and you keep your voice even. You don't issue orders like a guard. You speak like someone who is trying to keep a shared thing working. And most of them respond to that. A canal is a long, thin community, and today you're the point where it narrows. As mid-afternoon leans on, the queue grows into something almost settled. Boats tie to rings, ropes crossing the towpath in neat angles. Cabin chimneys breathe out low smoke that drifts flat across the water. Somebody knocks out a pipe against an iron edge. Somebody laughs, briefly, then the sound fades. A child sits on a cabin step, legs swinging, watching your hands turn the windlass like it's a clock key. You become aware that your lock side has turned into a waiting room. And waiting rooms need information, or they invent their own. So you keep speaking gently as you work. You tell them you've sent word before, when a lock needed attention. You tell them the lengthman will come if he can be spared. You don't promise a time. You only promise you're not ignoring it. Then, between boats, you make a decision that moves you from managing to improvising. You're going to reduce that top gate leak, even if you can't clear the wedge fully. To do that, you need to take pressure off the meeting face for a moment. Not by draining a whole pound, just by changing the head across the gate briefly in a controlled way. You wait until the chamber is empty and the lower gates are closed. Then you look up at the upper pound and down at the chamber, and you judge the difference. There's still head up top. Enough to pin that wedge tight. So, you choose to draw the upper pound down a little, on purpose, in a place where you can control it. It sounds strange, but a small, planned loss can prevent a large, uncontrolled one. You fit the windlass to the stubborn paddle, the one that won't seat. You turn it up, just a touch, not to open it wide, but to move it and then bring it down again. Sometimes, lifting and lowering clears a bit of grit off the seat. Sometimes, it makes the problem show itself more clearly. You lift. You feel the gear resist, then move. Water begins to hiss a little louder through the culvert. You count your turns by feel, then reverse, bringing it down. And there, again, the final settle doesn't come. The spindle stops, but you can feel it hasn't truly seated. That tells you the trouble isn't just grit on the rack teeth. It's likely down at the paddle itself, where you can't see it, underwater, in the culvert mouth. A bit of wood, a stone, a warped board. Anything that lets water sneak around the edge. You set the windlass aside, and you rub your thumb and forefinger together, feeling the grease. Now you decide on a more physical measure. Stop planks. If your lock has the grooves, you can slide thick boards down into slots in the masonry, creating a temporary barrier. Not at the gate. At the culvert opening, or at a point where the flow can be checked. Not every lock is fitted for it in a convenient way, but many on working canals were built with emergencies in mind, because water is money. You walk to the side where the grooves are, running down the lock wall like narrow vertical scars. You brush moss away with your palm and you look for the iron staples set into the stone used to guide boards. They're there, old, rusted at the edges, but sound. In the shed, behind coiled ropes and a spare beam chain, you keep a set of planks for this very purpose. They're heavy, thick timber, their ends worn from being dropped into place. You drag the first one out, the wood rasping on the floor, then another. Each board is a two-person lift if you're honest. But you've learned how to move heavy things alone, one end at a time using the ground. You carry them to the lock edge and lay them down. Now you need a moment when you can place them without endangering a boat. So you call to the crews waiting. You ask for a few minutes, with no movement. You tell them you're going to try to check the leak, and it'll save time later. A few of them grumble again, but the grumble is softer now, because everyone can see the queue, and everyone can imagine it longer. Two boatmen step forward without being asked. One of them is older, with hands that look permanently stained by tar and rope. The other is younger, but built strong from hauling. They don't speak much. They just take an end of a plank when you lift. You nod to them, and together you slide the first board down into the grooves. The wood scrapes against stone, then drops the last inch with a hollow thump as it meets the bottom. A sound like a lid closing. Then the second plank. Then the third, overlapping, creating a temporary wall. Now, if the seal is decent, it should reduce flow through the culvert mouth, or at least slow it. You listen, the culvert whisper changes. It's still there, but duller, farther away. Ah, that's progress. You don't celebrate. You test. You watch the upper pound surface for a minute. The slow draw seems less eager. The level isn't rising, of course, but the sense of constant draining has eased. Now you turn to the top gate seam again. The stop planks won't fix the wedge at the quoin, but with less overall movement of water, you may have a little more breathing room to manage it. You leave the planks in place, and you tell the crews you'll start moving again. The two men step back to their boats as if they never left. A small kindness done without ceremony. And now you work the lock with even more attention to the order of steps. With stop planks in, you must be careful. You can't open certain paddles fully, or you'll drive water where it can't go and create turbulence. So you use the paddles that still have clear flow, and you lift them only part way. The lock becomes a quieter machine, slower, more deliberate, and in a way that suits the late afternoon. The light is softer now, turning the wet stone faces a gentle grey. Shadows lengthen along the coping stones. A fly circles near the water and lands on a patch of weed. Boats move through one at a time, and you keep your notebook schedule like a small conductor's score. Up boat next, then down boat. Then the one with the deepest draft. You begin prioritizing not just by arrival, but by what the water can support. This is the part of the job nobody writes down. It isn't in the printed rules. It's learned by watching boats scrape and by hearing men curse softly when they're stuck. And while you do all this, you keep listening for the lock's new sounds. A paddle gear that clacks a little too sharp. A gate that closes with a duller tone than before. A chain that drags in the water instead of lying clean. As the queue shifts, one boat comes in with a load of pottery ware, packed in straw. The steerer asks you to take it slow, as if you weren't already. You promise you will, and you mean it. Fragile loads make everyone more gentle, and that helps your day. You open paddles just enough to move levels without pulling the boat against the wall. You watch the rope angles. You guide with your hand, palm low, as if smoothing a sheet. And you feel the whole lock working at the edge of its patience, but still working. Then, late in the afternoon, the second complication sharpens. Even with stop planks, the upper pound is still dropping. Not as quickly as before, but steadily, because the top gate seam continues to pass water. And the more it drops, the more boats above begin to sit heavier. You see it first in the way a waiting boat's bow no longer drifts freely. It sits as if the water is thicker. Then you hear it, a faint shushing scrape somewhere above the bend. a hull brushing soft silt at the edge. That sound makes your decision for you. You need help. Not later, soon. You can manage a leak and a queue for a while, but if the pound drops enough, you'll have boats grounded above and below, and then nothing moves. So you choose a person to send. Not a boy, because you need the boy with the horse lines steady. Not one of the most impatient boatmen, because he'll stir the message with his own mood. You choose a steady man, someone you've seen wait without fuss. A cabin mate from one of the tide boats, whose crew can spare him for half an hour. You ask him quietly if he'll walk to the nearest maintenance yard, or the next lock where the lengthman might be. You tell him what to say. Topgate not seating, wedge at quoin. Offside paddle not dropping. Stop planks in, but pound falling. He nods once, and sets off at a steady walking pace along the towpath. You watch him go until the hedge hides him, then you turn back to the water. Now you have to make the lock behave on its own, for a while, with only your hands. You take a moment to look at the stop planks you've set. Their top edges are damp, darkened where the water licks them, and they sit tight in their grooves. They won't hold back a full head forever, but they can take the edge off the loss. You listen again at the culvert, and you're glad the whisper is duller now. Then you look at the top gate seam, and the bright line still shines like a thin blade. You can't fix everything at once, so you pick the one thing you can control best. You control movement, you control order, and you control how fast water is asked to change its mind. You step to the waiting boats and speak in small, practical sentences. You tell them you'll take one through, then hold, then one through again. You ask them to keep their horses off the pole and their lines ready. A few men nod, and you see shoulders loosen when a plan exists. The boat on the lower landing comes in when you signal. It's a mixed cargo boat, with sacks under a canvas, and the smell of damp rope. You bring it into the chamber without hurry, using the rope more than the pole. The bow slides past the gate recess, and you watch the clearance like you always do. When it's settled, you close the lower gates gently and hear the chains settle with a familiar clink. Now you have to fill from above again, and you do it as if you're pouring from a cup you can't refill. You lift the good paddle in small turns, and you pause between each lift. You watch the upper pound surface, and you watch the head gauge out of the corner of your eye. The gauge doesn't jump, but it does creep, and you feel that creeping is time. The chamber rises, and the boat rises with it, wood creaking softly as the pressure shifts. The steerer stands quiet, hands ready, eyes on your windlass. This is the kind of cooperation that comes when everyone's tired and nobody wants more trouble. When the levels meet, you open the top gate and it hesitates again at the first inch. You take the beam with your shoulder and let the hinge do its slow work. The gate swings open and the boat eases out, and you keep your palm down to remind them. Slow. Once the stern clears, you close the gate and it stops short, and the seam shines. You don't stare at it for long, because staring doesn't seat timber. Instead, you make a new decision that's less about repairs and more about saving the pound. You decide to reduce how often you reverse the lock. Every time you send one boat up, then one down, you waste time and lose water to leaks. So you begin batching, letting 2 or 3 boats go the same way when you can. You tell the waiting crews what you're doing, so it doesn't feel like unfairness. Up boats first, then down boats, as the level allows. You can hear the shift in mood when people understand the reason. A man still mutters, but he mutters to the water now, not to you. You work through the next pair, one after the other, keeping the paddles only partly raised. The chamber never froths, never surges hard against the walls, and that helps the gate fittings. Less turbulence means less strain, and less strain means fewer new problems. Between lockages, you walk up to the top gate again and try something small. You take your brush and scrub the quoin face where the bright line is strongest. You scrub as if you're cleaning a plate, firm but not frantic. Green slime comes away in ribbons, and the stone looks cleaner but the leak persists. Then you take your scraper and run it lightly along the meeting face of the gate. You're careful, because you don't want to gouge swollen wood. The scraper brings away a tiny curl of bruised grain, and you feel the ridge lessen. You close the gate again, and it still stops short, but the seam looks fractionally narrower. That's not a fix, but it's a reduction, and reductions matter on dry days. You take a pencil stub from your pocket and mark the worst point just above the waterline. A little cross on the timber, so your eyes find it quickly later. Now you return to the queue, because the queue is a living thing, and it keeps changing shape. Smoke drifts low from cabin chimneys, and the smell of tea rides on it again. A woman on one boat shakes out a cloth, then hangs it on a line between cabin and mast. A man on another boat taps ash from a pipe into the canal with a soft flick, and the child you noticed earlier leans out to watch the lock chamber fill, as if it's magic. You catch the child's eye, and you give the smallest nod, like a private greeting. Then you turn back to the work, because the work is what makes this place feel steady. You keep moving boats through, measured, deliberate, and you keep listening. You listen to the paddle gear, to the tone of the rack as it takes weight. You listen to the gate hinges and the way the balance beam creaks. There's a particular creak that means dry wood rubbing, and another that means a hinge pin is being forced. Today you're trying to hear the difference, so you can stop before damage happens. At one point, as you lower a boat, you notice the top gate leak briefly increases. It flares brighter for a few seconds, then narrows again. That tells you something else is moving in the seam, shifting under pressure changes. It might be that wedge you felt, rocking slightly as the head changes. And that suggests a possibility, not a fast one, but a careful one. If you can change the head across that gate in a controlled way, you might free it. Not with force, but with timing. You begin to plan for it, in the spaces between boats. You can't drain the upper pound, and you won't, but you can draw the lock chamber down just enough at a quiet moment to reduce squeeze on the seam. That means waiting for a gap and choosing the right water level to hold. So you keep moving boats, and you keep watching the queue for a natural pause. After a while, the line thins slightly because boats behind have moored earlier to cook or rest a horse. The canal day is long, and even impatient people have to eat. You see your moment, small and ordinary, and you take it. The chamber is empty, and there's no boat directly at the landings. You close both lower gates, and you make sure their paddles are fully down. Then you stand at the top end and look at the seam again. Bright line, steady, still taking its payment. Now, with the stop plank still helping at the culvert, you begin your careful head change. You crack a lower paddle just a little, just enough to let the lock chamber fall a hand's breadth. You watch the water line on the chamber wall, and you count the stones as it drops. You don't need much, only enough to change pressure at the top gate. When the chamber has lowered slightly, you close that paddle again. And now, for a moment, the head across the top gate is a little less. You go to the balance beam and close the gate gently, then press it home with your shoulder. It stops short, as before, but the resistance feels different. Less spring, more of a soft catch. You kneel and slide the scraper into the seam again, at the spot you marked. This time, it goes a fraction deeper. You feel it meet something hard. You work it with tiny movements, not prying, just teasing. For a long moment, nothing happens. Then you feel the smallest give, like grit shifting. A tiny pebble or a chip of stone pops free and drops into the water with a faint tick. You don't even see it, but you feel its absence. You close the gate again and press. The gate moves that last inch, slow and reluctant, then meets the quine properly. It's not a slam, it's a soft, solid stop, like a door finally sitting in its frame. You lean close to the seam. The bright line is still there, but it's thinner and broken in places now. A leak reduced is water saved, and water saved is time bought. You sit back on your heels for a moment and let yourself breathe. This is the kind of repair that doesn't look like anything from a distance. No dramatic change, no cheering, just a quieter lock. You stand, wipe your hands on your rag, and return to the queue. Now you can move boats with a little more confidence because one of your drains has slowed. You remove the small temporary drawdown by bringing the chamber back to normal level for the next lockage. And you keep the stock planks in because that paddle culvert still can't be trusted. A lockkeeper learns to accept imperfect solutions for a day if they keep the system alive. As afternoon leans towards evening, the light turns warmer and shadows lay longer across the water. A breeze carries the smell of cut grass from a field beyond the hedge, and then at last you see the messenger returning along the towpath. He's not running, he's walking steady, and that steadiness tells you he found someone. Behind him, another figure appears, carrying a long-handled tool over one shoulder. The figure walks with the patient stride of someone used to miles of towpath. A lengthman, or a company carpenter, coming out toward trouble with his hands already thinking. As they draw nearer, you can see the kit, a canvas bag, heavy with iron, a tin of grease, and a short maul, the kind that makes a soft, persuasive thud, rather than a sharp crack. You meet them near the cottage, and you exchange only the necessary words. You point with your chin at the top gate, then at the paddle gear. They nod, because they've seen it all before, in some form. The repairman sets his bag down on the grass and opens it like a doctor opening a case. Out comes a spanner, worn smooth, a handful of wedges, oak and iron mixed. A punch, a drift, and a small hammer. You feel the day shift from managing and improvising to careful fixing. But careful fixing still has to happen around boats, because the canal hasn't stopped needing to move. So you and the repairman look at the queue together. You decide, together, to hold movements for a short window, then release boats in a measured trickle again. You tell the nearest steerer he'll be 10 minutes, maybe a little more. He nods and sits back, resigned, lighting his pipe again. The repairman goes straight to the top gate heel post area, where wood meets iron. He crouches and looks, not at the obvious scene, but at the fittings. He puts his hand on the heel post and gives it a small shake. You can't see much move, but you see his eyes narrow, as if he feels it. He points to a worn strap, a place where iron has fretted against wood over years. He says, quiet, that the heel post has a touch of play. Not enough to fail, but enough to sag the gate by a fraction when head presses. That sag changes how the gate meets the sill and how it meets the quoin. And when a boat bumps the gate, that sag becomes a pinch. Now the day's events line up into one simple story. Wear in the heel fitting, wobble in the gear, and a bump that turns small looseness into a steady leak. The repairman asks you to bring the lock to a particular state. He wants the chamber level low enough to reduce pressure, but not drained. He wants the gate almost floating free, but still supported, so you work the paddles together, carefully bringing the water down to the mark he indicates. He watches the water line as if it's a measuring tool. When it's right, he tells you to stop, and you stop. Then he wedges the balance beam lightly, so the gate can't swing unexpectedly. Safety on a canal is quiet, and it looks like wedges and blocked beams. Now he takes his maul and taps a wooden wedge near the heel post fitting. Not driving it hard, just taking up slack, aligning. He tells you to watch the seam at the quoin while he works. You crouch at the top gate seam, eyes close to the water. As he taps and adjusts, you see the leak change. It narrows, then widens, then narrows again as the gate's angle shifts by tiny degrees. He pauses and asks, "How is it now?" You tell him, "A little better." He taps again, then holds, then asks again. You tell him, "Better still," but there's still a thread. He nods, as if that's expected. Then he moves to the sill end and takes a long iron bar, used like a lever. He slides it carefully where he can, feeling for the lodged splinter you suspected earlier. He works by touch, because the water hides everything that matters. After a minute, he fishes out something pale and wet, a thin splinter of wood. It might have come from the bruised meeting face, or from old debris. Either way, it's been acting like a shim under pressure. He tosses it onto the grass, and it sticks there dripping. You close the gate gently again, and this time it seats more willingly. The sound changes too. It's a deeper, more final tone when wood meets stone correctly. You lean close and look at the seam. The bright line is now a faint shimmer in only 1 or 2 spots. That's the difference between losing a pound all evening and losing only a little. Now the repairman turns his attention to the stubborn paddle. He kneels by the gear frame and runs his fingers along the rack teeth. Huh? He asks you to lift it slightly, just enough for him to see motion. You set the windlass on the spindle and turn, slow and steady. The rack rises, and you both listen. There's a faint grind, not loud, but present, like sand in a hinge. He tells you to hold it, and he peers down into the housing. Then he tells you to lower it. You reverse slowly, and he watches for the final seat. It still doesn't settle cleanly. He nods and says, "It's likely fouled at the paddle itself, down in the culvert." He asks if you have stopped planks in. You tell him you do, and you show him. He nods again, because that means you can create a safer condition to work. Together, you decide on a sequence. You'll keep boats held for a short time. You'll draw down to reduce flow. You'll open access enough to clear the paddle seat, then reseat and test. It's slow work, and it can't be rushed, because water pressure punishes hurry. You go to the waiting crews and tell them, calm, you'll be holding a little longer. You promise them that once it's right, you'll move them steadily. A man calls out, asking how long. You answer honestly, you don't know exactly, but you're making it sound. He accepts that, because it's the only kind of